It's 400 BCE. You're standing in the middle of the Persian desert. The sun is doing something personal to you. The ground is basically an oven with sand on top, and somebody just handed you a block of ice. Not a snow cone, not a slushy, an actual, solid, don't touch it too long block of ice. In the desert, in summer, centuries before anyone had heard the word electricity, let alone figured out how to put it inside a kitchen appliance. That also, somehow, has an app now. So here's the question that should be bothering you right now. How do you keep something frozen in a place that is actively, aggressively trying to melt everything it touches? No freezers, no compressors, no little light that turns on when you open the door, no little water dispenser that never quite lines up with your cup correctly, just heat, sand, and somehow ice. The answer involves a giant mud dome, a very clever misunderstanding of how cold works, and civilizations on 3 different continents independently, arriving at the same trick without ever comparing notes. Let's get into it. First, the mechanism, because everyone assumes ancient ice storage was about making things cold. It wasn't. Nobody in 400 BCE was manufacturing cold air out of nothing. That's not the trick. The trick was never generating cold. The trick was stopping heat from getting in. That's it. That's the whole secret. Cold isn't a thing you add. Cold is just the absence of heat, and if you can physically block heat from reaching something, whatever cold is already there just stays. Ancient engineers weren't fighting to create cold. They were building fortresses to keep heat out. Completely different problem, completely different solution, and it changes everything about how you think about this. It sounds like a small distinction, but it's actually the entire foundation of refrigeration as a concept, and ancient civilizations figured it out with mud and straw thousands of years before anyone had the word thermodynamics to describe what they were doing. Now let's talk about the building that pulled this off better than almost anything else in the ancient world. The Yakhchāl. If you've never heard the word, that's fair, most people haven't, and that's a crime, because the Yakhchāl might be the single most underrated piece of ancient engineering on the planet. Persian engineers, starting somewhere around 400 BCE, built these massive conical structures, sometimes over 60 feet tall, out of a special heat-resistant mortar called saruj, made from sand, clay, egg whites, goat hair, and ash mixed in specific ratios that took generations to refine. Yes, egg whites. Ancient Persians were binding their thermal insulation with omelet ingredients, and it worked better than a lot of things we build today. The shape wasn't decorative. That dome geometry created a natural airflow loop, pulling hot air up and out through a vent at the top, while the thick walls, sometimes several feet deep, blocked heat radiation from ever reaching the interior. Underground, below the dome, there'd be a deep pit, sometimes connected to a cannet, an underground water channel bringing in cool water from nearby mountains. Cannets themselves are a whole engineering marvel on their own, gently sloped tunnels dug sometimes for miles underground, using gravity alone to move water across entire regions without a single pump. Persian engineers weren't just solving the ice problem, they were solving water scarcity, agriculture, and climate control, all with the same underground infrastructure, which tells you something about how seriously this civilization took the problem of surviving its own climate. During winter, they'd pack the pit with snow and ice hauled down from those same mountains. Then they'd seal it, and that ice would sit there, insulated, from a desert summer, for months. Sometimes it lasted well into the following year. The people managing these structures understood something we rarely think about today, that insulation isn't a single trick, it's a system, a combination of material choice, geometry, airflow, and underground placement, all working together to fight the exact same enemy, which was heat trying to sneak in from every possible direction. Let that sink in for a second. No modern insulation, no electricity, no refrigerant gases, just mud, straw, egg whites, gravity, and airflow. And it worked well enough that yakhchāls were still functioning as ice houses into the 20th century, right up until electric refrigeration made them economically pointless rather than technically obsolete. The building didn't fail. The century just moved on without it. Some yakhchāls still stand today. In Iran, weathered but structurally intact, quietly outlasting several empires, and at least a couple of industrial revolutions. But Persia wasn't alone in this. This is where it gets genuinely interesting, because the same basic idea shows up independently, thousands of miles apart, with zero contact between the civilizations doing it. Go back even further, to Mesopotamia, roughly 1780 BCE, and you'll find records from the ancient city of Mari on the Euphrates River describing an ice house built specifically to store ice for the royal court. Cuneiform tablets from the period mention constructing a structure explicitly designed to keep ice through the hot months, built near the river specifically so ice could be harvested locally rather than transported long distances. That's over 1,000 years before the Yakhchāl even existed, and the core logic is already there. Dig down, insulate heavily, block the heat, keep the ice. The fact that this shows up in official royal correspondence tells you it wasn't a hobby project either. Ice storage was important enough to warrant government resources, skilled labor, and apparently bragging rights. Jump to ancient China, and you'll find ice pits referenced in texts going back to the Zhou Dynasty, around 1000 BCE, where workers would harvest ice from frozen rivers in winter and store it in deep, straw-insulated pits for use during the summer months, often reserved for the aristocracy because, naturally, ancient civilizations gate-kept air conditioning the same way we gatekeep good Wi-Fi passwords. The Book of Songs, one of the oldest surviving collections of Chinese poetry, literally references ice cutting and ice storage as an established seasonal practice. This wasn't experimental. This was routine infrastructure. There were entire government positions dedicated to managing ice supply, officials whose actual job title translates roughly to something like Keeper of the Ice, which is, frankly, a job title that deserves to come back. By later dynasties, ice houses in China had become elaborate multi-chambered structures, sometimes built partially underground with multiple insulating layers of straw, reed matting, and packed earth, refined over centuries the same way any technology gets refined when enough generations keep tinkering with it. And then there's Rome, because of course there's Rome. Roman elites built structures called nivaria, snow pits, often lined with straw, wood, and sometimes cork, used to store snow packed down into ice throughout the year. Wealthy Romans would have snow hauled down from mountains, compress it into dense ice blocks, and store it specifically to chill wine and food during summer banquets, because even 2,000 years ago, rich people's top priority was making sure their drinks stayed cold. There are records of snow being sold in Roman markets as a luxury good, transported by relay teams moving quickly, enough to prevent total melt, an ancient version of expedited shipping, except the cargo was actively trying to disappear the entire time. So here's your complicating twist. This wasn't one brilliant civilization figuring out a clever trick and everyone else copying it. Persia, Mesopotamia, China, and Rome developed insulated ice storage largely independently in different centuries, using different materials, arriving at the same underlying physics without any of them teaching it to the others. That's not coincidence. That's convergent engineering. When multiple separate groups of humans facing a similar problem land on the same solution independently, that's usually a sign the solution wasn't actually that hard to stumble into. Once you're paying close enough attention to your environment. And humans, whatever else you want to say about us, have always paid close attention to comfort. We complain about a slightly warm hotel room in 2026. Someone in Mesopotamia in 1780 BCE was engineering entire buildings around the same basic discomfort. Now, the unifying theory pulling all of this together isn't really about ice at all. It's about two physics principles that ancient civilizations independently discovered through trial and error centuries before anyone had the vocabulary of thermodynamics to explain why any of it worked. The first is thermal mass and insulation. Thick walls, dense mud mortar, underground construction, all of it slows down heat transfer. Heat doesn't teleport. It has to move through material, and thick, dense, well-chosen material moves heat through it painfully slowly. That delay is the entire game. Every civilization we've talked about figured this out through pure observation, noticing that things buried deep stayed cooler, that thick walls felt cooler to the touch than thin ones, and building increasingly elaborate structures around that single repeated observation. The second is evaporative cooling, which shows up constantly in these designs, without ever being named as such. Wet surfaces, underground water channels, airflow moving across cool wet stone, all of it pulls additional heat out of the surrounding air. Ancient engineers didn't need to know the words latent heat of vaporization to exploit the effect. They just needed to notice that water plus airflow plus shade equals things staying cooler, and then build architecture around that observation, over and over, for centuries, refining it generation by generation. That's the twist worth sitting with. These weren't lucky discoveries. They were the result of ancient civilizations running centuries long, unintentional science experiments, refining insulation techniques the same way we refine software, through constant iteration, failure, and small improvements passed down from builder to builder, generation to generation, long before anyone wrote the underlying rules down in a textbook. Which brings us to now. Your refrigerator is running the exact same core principle as a Persian yakhchāl. Insulated walls to block heat exchange. Sealed interior to prevent hot air from constantly flooding in. The only real difference is that your fridge uses a compressor and refrigerant to actively pump heat out, instead of relying purely on thermal mass and airflow like the ancients did. We didn't invent a new idea. We electrified an old one. Somewhere in a Persian desert, an engineer with mud, straw, and egg whites solved the conceptual half of the problem thousands of years before anyone solved the mechanical half. The compressor is genuinely new. The core idea of seal it up and don't let the heat in is thousands of years old and hasn't changed even slightly. So next time you open your freezer and grab ice without thinking about it for even half a second, remember that somebody in 1780 BCE, in the middle of Mesopotamia, was doing something conceptually identical with a hole in the ground, some straw, and a serious amount of patience. No electricity. No refrigerant. Just a genuinely sharp understanding of how heat moves, applied, with tools that would look laughably primitive to us and produced results that worked for literally thousands of years across multiple continents in wildly different climates, refined independently by people who never once spoke to each other. We like to think of modern comfort as something we invented. Most of the time, we just automated something ancient humans had already figured out the hard way: one mud dome, one snow pit, one buried block of ice at a time. The refrigerator hums quietly in the corner of your kitchen, and somewhere buried underneath that hum is a Persian engineer's idea that's been running uninterrupted for roughly 2,500 years. So, would you have trusted a giant mud cone in the middle of the desert to keep your drinks cold for 6 months? Let me know in the comments. Until then, see you.